Hello. I'd like to welcome all of you to the third of our four-part series on careers in public service. We asked Dartmouth sophomores what kinds of programs they would be interested in this summer, and this series is the result. Next week will be our last panel on international development. We hope you can join us then as well. Today's panel focuses on nonprofit work. We've assembled 4 alumni doing vastly different, but all very interesting work in the nonprofit sector. I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions to ask our panelists. Please ask your questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Today, we will be joined by Shadi Mervazan, who's one of our student assistants. Hi, Shadi. She will be handling the Q&A portion of this event. I am going to introduce you ever so briefly to our panelists, and I'll let them talk because I'm sure you're all interested in hearing from them more than you are hearing from me. So in alphabetical order, may I present Brian Freeman, an associate and / scientist at Associates and a member of the class of 2011. Josh Koenig, Program Officer for North America and the Caribbean at Trust Law of Thompson Reuters Foundation, class of 2016. Farah Salam, Community Health and Wellbeing Coordinator at the Arab American Family Support Center and a member of the class of 2017. And finally, Derek Somerville, National Youth Engagement Director at YMCA Youth and Government, class of 2011. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you giving your time. And Brian, I'll turn it over to you so you can tell us how you spent your time in Dartmouth and what you've been doing since then.
All right, thanks, Joanne. Hi, everybody. My name is Brian Freeman. As Joanne mentioned, I'm an associate in the Social and Economic Policy Division of Apt Associates. I'm based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Graduated Dartmouth 2011 with a major in government and a minor in public policy. So while I was at Dartmouth, I worked in the policy research shop and interned at the U.S. Department of Education and Action for Boston Community Development. I joined Apt Associates right after graduation from Dartmouth to work on evaluations of social programs for federal clients, including the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Department of Education, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Then went to get a master's degree in education policy and management from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where I worked on the strategic data project at the Center for Education Policy Research. Since returning to Apt in 2014, I've contributed to research on topics such as college access, financial well-being, inclusive education, family leave, early childhood education, and national service. I'll turn it over now to Josh to introduce himself.
Hey everybody, I'm Josh Koenig, class of 2016. Currently I serve as the program officer for the Trust Law program in North America and the Caribbean at Thomson Reuters Foundation. So Thomson Reuters Foundation is an independent charitable foundation associated with the Thomson Reuters Corporation. If you've heard of them, you'll probably most know them for the Reuters newswire. So Reuters journalists are a part of the work that Thomson Reuters does. Trust Law is a program that we run in 175 countries that works to partner nonprofits and social enterprises with leading law firms for free pro bono work that accelerates impact. So it's both transactional day-to-day work and then also doing legal research, doing policy research that organizations can then use in their advocacy work and as they push for social impact. So I manage our member network in US, Canada, and throughout the Caribbean. At Dartmouth, did a lot of different work with Rocky, also spent a summer not as a first-year fellow, but did civic skills training with the first-year fellows, working on the Hill for a congressman from just outside of Chicago, where I'm from, and also spent a summer interning with then Mayor Rahm Emanuel's office in the city of Chicago. And then post-Dartmouth, on my way to the current role, spent the time immediately after I graduated working as an organizer in the 2016 election cycle and helped elect Tammy Duckworth, who's now a U.S. Senator from Illinois, to the U.S. Senate. Then spent about 2.5 years with Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, which is the Chicago affiliate of the National Civil Rights Organization, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, while doing that work, also did a 6-month fellowship program with the Obama Foundation called the Community Leadership Course. So it's for folks 18 to 24 years old who are interested in developing leadership tools and skill sets around mobilizing communities on issue-based organizing campaigns. And now I'm at Thompson Reuters Foundation. And I'll turn it over to whoever's next. I'm not sure.
I can go next. Hi, everyone. My name is Farah Salam. I graduated from the MALS program at Dartmouth, which is part of the Borini School of Graduate Studies. At the time, it wasn't part of the School of Graduate Studies because the Graduate Studies School opened in like 2016. So I'll talk a little bit about what I did before Dartmouth and then during Dartmouth and then after. So before Dartmouth, I was an undergraduate at Quinnipiac University. I received a BA both in psychology and political science over there. And while I was an undergraduate, I worked for a congresswoman for 2 years, as well as working in an elementary school that served vulnerable populations such as Hispanic and Black youth in New Haven, Connecticut. And I also worked on research projects based on social psychological studies, perceptions of gay men within their community and from out the community. And then when I went to Dartmouth, I studied in the MALS program. I studied on the globalization track with a focus on international development in South Asia and the Middle East and humanitarian responses to wars and conflict. And I was in the MLDP program through Rocky, and that's how I got involved on campus. And I was also part of the graduate school student council as well. And I was one of the representatives for the MALS program. While at Dartmouth, I began working at a small nonprofit in Connecticut. I went back home while I was writing my thesis to take care of my grandmother. So I went back home and I started working at a small nonprofit that focused on bringing education and health education primarily to young high schoolers and college-age students in mental health, in public education health, and in understanding the opioid crisis in Waterbury, Connecticut. And from there, I moved on and worked in refugee resettlement for about a year, a little over a year, where we worked primarily with Eritrean and Congolese refugees. And I worked as their medical case manager, as well as forming relationships with different hospitals in the area to make sure that all the refugees got the medical care that they needed. And then over the past 2 years, I've been working at the Arab American Family Support Center, where I'm a program manager and program coordinator for the Community Health and Wellbeing Program. I work primarily with the city and different agencies to ensure that we are working with the community, the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian communities, to ensure proper access to healthcare, to ensure proper access to mental health care, to ensure proper health coverage for undocumented folks, and to make sure that the voices of our community are heard and advocated for in city council and throughout the state. So that's just a little bit of what I've done, and now I'm going to pass it on to Derek.
All right, I think I'm unmuted. Thanks, guys. Sorry, I'm wearing a mask. We have people in the office, so we have a new mask policy in DC. So until I can speak, I got to wear that. My name is Derek Somerville. I work with the YMCA. I'm based in Washington, DC. Right now, I work on behalf of about 50,000 students around the country that work on our civic engagement and service learning programs. Those are in 43 states and here in DC. Primarily what I do is help our students engage in advocacy work in their communities, as well as in public service training, as well as service learning programs. Quite literally, my whole world stopped functioning on March 15th, much like everyone else. But for me, part of my job is giant events with students in places around the country. And clearly that kind of shifted. So I actually sit here in DC as part of our government relations team. So for the past few months, I've been working with our government relations team, developing the youth advocacy strategy as we respond and work with Congress and state legislatures when it comes to helping give YMCAs the resources they need. YMCAs serve 2,700 communities around the country. We have about 20 million members. About half of those are young people. We are dealing, if you pick an issue that COVID-19 has caused, the Y is dealing with it. We are one of the nation's largest providers of emergency childcare. Almost all of our facilities that were once gyms or places you went to swim or places you went to do programming are now places where we're doing socially distant childcare. We are, in many cases, we're COVID testing sites. We are also places where hospital workers and first responders are living because they can't live with their families. Most of our YMCAs have no revenue with memberships declining, so we've been advocating for programs like PPP, like Main Street loans. So my whole role now has been connecting young people in our movement to helping advocate and further those causes. So it's been quite an adventure the past few months. Back at Rocky, I'm at 11, much like Brian. I was part-time a first-year fellow, but then ended up working with the YMCA that summer. I was also part of the Dartmouth Teacher Education Program, so I worked on my secondary social studies certification while I was a student. I did work at the policy research shop around, at that point, financial education or financial literacy in New Hampshire. I also worked at the town of Hanover and some sustainability work as part of the research shop. But one of the things that I'm most proud of is I went and worked in the Marshall Islands as part of the teacher education program, and actually did a model parliament program out there in the capital of Majuro. The Marshall Islands are one of the only countries in the world that are not just actively experiencing the effects of climate change. They're losing land, feet every year. But they're also having a large migration issue where whole communities are being uprooted and being forced to go to places like Springfield, Arkansas, or Washington, or Hawaii, where there are large Marshallese populations. So I've done a lot of work with that, and I've continued to be a part of that process with a lot of the students that I work with in the Marshalls as they've relocated over here. But happy to be here.
Great. Thank you to all of you for those very amazing and impressive introductions. Before I get to some more general questions for the panel, I just want to remind our audience that if you have any questions for our panelists, you can ask those questions, type them into the Q&A section. Feel free to do that throughout this event. But for now, just a couple questions for any panelists ready and willing to answer. Our first question is, what's one critical lesson that you've learned that you could share with undergrads, me and my peers who aspire to work in the nonprofit sector?
Brian, why don't you go first? We'll go, or whoever wants to take it.
Oh no, I'm still thinking. You go first, Eric.
Farah, you look like you had something to say.
Oh yeah. One thing that I've learned that I think is really critical when it comes to working in nonprofit is just being flexible. Things happen at any time. Things change because the nature of nonprofit is that we do get funding from outside sources such as city, state, or federal. And whenever policy changes, that means our funding streams change. And whenever that changes, that means our programming change. So being flexible is key.
Yeah, I think on my end, one of the things that you just have to know is you guys are going to be coming into a nonprofit sector that is completely changed. And I know a lot of people are talking about how industries are going to be changed by this, but nonprofits rely on so many of the institutional structures that are being wiped out right now. The philanthropy and the financial underpinnings of the nonprofit sector are completely being transformed, and the availability of that. So making sure that you have, I think flexibility is the right word. But the other thing I would remember is patience. For me, patience is key. It's not a sector that responds as quickly. The other piece that I would mention is nonprofit sector is divided into kind of, at least in my eyes, you've got old institutional groups. I work for one of them that can sometimes be seen as working too slow. We don't respond as quickly as we should. We're always active. We've seen more reactive now than we did 100 years ago. But understanding both the benefits of some of the larger scalable institutional nonprofit work, as well as some of that micro on the ground community work, and figuring out where your talent and passion might better direct you.
All right, great, thank you. Another question that we've received is, how should undergrads be kind of thinking about educational and skills attainment relative to pursuing an interest in the nonprofit sector, whether that means going to graduate school or developing skills that they could attain within or outside of Dartmouth post-graduation? What have you seen being kind of an ideal route or skills that you think are important to attain?
I can also answer this. I think for the specific nonprofit that I work for, having a background in social work or public health or some sort of community-based grassroots organizing is very key, mainly because the nonprofit that we have a foster care system within, like a foster care program, then we have our health program, and then we have our English program, and we have our legal program. So having some, and we all intersect with one person. I work with all other programs in the, I don't come from a social work background. The thing I have to social work is my psychology degree from undergraduate, but experiences that I've built while in grad school and after grad school have helped me get to the position where I am right now, because I have a experience working with refugees, working with immigrants, working in the education system, working in different healthcare systems and medical systems and the health education system. So because I have that specific exposure, it's been helpful for me when I ultimately came to this point in my career. Like answers the question, but those are like the real life experience, as well as, you know, having the academic experience is very key.
I'd say for sort of work that I do, and I think probably more broadly, kind of divided up into kind of having some understanding of the subject matter or the content of the, or subject matter of the work. You know, in my case, you know, kind of understanding something about education or social policy in general, and then also having the technical skills for the role. So the, you know, the work that I do is very much a research role. So we're looking for a lot of the research skills that you'll get at Dartmouth, or possibly an internship working with a professor writing a thesis. So the quantitative, qualitative analysis, doing some lit reviews, kind of working with enrolling study participants, kind of managing report writing, those sort of things. So I think kind of understanding, not just, you know, one part of it is understanding the subject matter of the organization, but the other is really understanding what the role is and what are kind of the day-to-day skills that you need for that sort of role.
Ryan, I'm wondering too if it might be helpful to talk about your thinking when you decided to go do a graduate program. So kind of what were the trade-offs? Were you talking to colleagues at the time? I think that just on this question could be really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And I think generally am in favor of kind of spending some time to work before you go to grad school, just so you get a sense of understanding, you know, try something if you like it, if it, you know, seems like something you want to stick around with. If so, you know, see what sort of degrees and programs other people who are, you know, in that industry with some more experience have. That's basically what I did, you know, started out doing the work, really enjoyed the work, wanted to stay in doing that sort of work. So talked to some folks about what the options were. You know, in this case, you got kind of the differences between a master, like a policy related master's or a PhD, and then can kind of found a program that worked for me. But I think generally, unless you're really, really rock solid about what you want to do, I think it's nice to have a couple years of work experience doing something, talking to people who have worked in that industry, who, you know, have different ideas about what sort of graduate programs make sense if you want to do that, or if you try something, it's really not a great fit for you, that can, you know, kind of spark a reappraisal of what sort of graduate programs make sense, if a graduate program is necessary even for the career path that you want to go down.
Yeah, and that's really, thank you for that insight. And that's really, really helpful to know for many undergraduates considering current climate, as well as the fact that that's a very common question, I think, regardless of the discipline you're interested in pursuing. Another question we've had is, perhaps, I don't know if who can maybe contribute to this, but what have been some highs in your career journey so far, and what have been some memorable challenges, and have those challenges perhaps been even in the last few months?
I'm happy to jump in on this one as other folks are thinking, and I want to talk about a challenge particularly. So I'm 4 years out of school, right? But an early career challenge that I've encountered, because I think it also is a piece of advice that can be really helpful. So if you are interested in nonprofit sector work, you're probably interested in mission-driven work, right? So working for an organization where when you go to the office every day, you feel like there's a community that I'm fighting on behalf of, or I'm driving social change work. And that is really, really exciting, and we're thrilled that you all want to do that, because from Dartmouth, you're going to have a lot of options, and choosing a career where you can go in every day and pursue a mission, we really hope and want to support you in that interest. But it also can be really hard then to start to establish the boundaries between the time that you spend working and your personal work. And I know that for me, early career, this was a particular challenge that I had. So one of the things I was doing when I was at Lawyers Committee in Chicago is running intake. So any organization that does either legal support, assistance support, program support is going to have a process where they consider new individuals who are applying for assistance for whether the organization can help that. And I was particularly looking at hate crimes, housing discrimination, and education equities, looking at students who have been impacted by school to prison pipeline practices. And I wanted so badly to help every one of the individuals that came in. And we both had organizational capacity, and then I personally had time capacity. So sometimes, a call would come in and we wouldn't be able to get back to it until the next day, unless I stayed at the office till 8 or 9 p.m. and was calling someone at that time. So I think that it's a challenge that you're going to see in mission-driven work, particularly if that mission-driven work is dealing directly with impacted individuals. And I guess the piece of advice that I would give is try the best that you can to recognize that you will be the most effective as an advocate when there is a balance where you're able to rest and recharge from that work, but you also want to set yourself up to be doing, as much impact work as you can. So just a challenge, I think, early career. I think, I had colleagues at Chicago Lawyers Committee who would tell me, the organization was here before you came, and it's probably going to be here after you leave. So don't put the weight of the entire organization on your own shoulders. You're surrounded by colleagues. You have a team. You can lean on each other and do that work together. So I'll stop there, but just something I wanted to share on this question.
Yeah, I'll definitely plus one to everything that Josh said. Yep, no one is indispensable in a good way. So, it's important to kind of establish the boundaries between work and personal life, even especially when doing mission-driven work. Say another aspect of that, especially if you're interested in the mission, you want to make an impact, is, sometimes you'll have those great experiences, the great wins, kind of in my case where kind of we get a report out and then it kind of makes a splash. There's, kind of starts impacting the policy conversation, and that's very gratifying, kind of getting evidence out there and, out into the real world. But, the day-to-day can be a little bit of a grind. There can be things that are less exciting. You kind of, if you're really zoomed in on the ground level, you don't necessarily see the impact, in every single little thing that you're doing. So kind of having that sense of perspective, and finding something that you care enough about that, you're willing to get through the frustrating or annoying bits, I think is important.
Thank you. That was really helpful to know. And just a reminder to our audience that any questions you have can be put in the Q&A box, and we will get to those right away. Another question, and maybe Derek and Farah, you mentioned this a little bit in your kind of introduction, but what kind of experience at Dartmouth in particular best prepared you for a future in nonprofits? And if you could elaborate a little more on like the skills and the nature of the experience that really lended itself to long-term kind of helpful things in your career.
Yeah, I could take that. So as I mentioned, I had a chance to do a term abroad in the Marshall Islands, which I don't know if Dartmouth still does that or not. I think it's available through outside volunteer opportunities. But one of the things that was, I think, the most challenging was nonprofit work, especially in some of the more direct nonprofit work, is not just a lot of flexibility and patience, but a lot of creativity and doing a lot with a little. It can be, it's also about making sure that you're leveraging networks and partners in a way that is always using them as a support system and not seeing it as antagonistic. What prepared me the most was having to go to a place I didn't understand and find partners in the community that could help me understand that something I wanted to help their students with would not be possible if I didn't first build some of the trust and community infrastructure that needed to take place. So I think for me, that was one of the more influential pieces. But what the other thing is I consistently was always, I volunteered throughout my entire time in college, sometimes to the detriment of my studies. But I was doing that to try and figure out what were the best, what did I really want to do versus what did I think I wanted to do. And I think that's kind of the, I don't think you'll figure that out. I still haven't figured that out, 10 years or so out. But I think from being in college, one of those things is try those on, especially in the nonprofit sector. There are lots of different spaces within the nonprofit sector that you can work with. If it's direct service, if it's something that's more behind the scenes, everyone's got their, I think exactly what Josh is saying. There are different versions of those roles where everyone will be able to find that right balance so that you're not flaming out. I don't call it burning out. You have such a passionate flame within you a lot of times when you're serving in the nonprofit sector that you don't even know what's happening and then it's out like a light. And I think for us, it's about finding the role that, really feeds you. For me, I knew I needed to work with young people or else I wasn't going to have find that correct balance because I was too detached. So at the same time though, I got to be careful because young people are also some of the most diverse when it comes to needs in terms of communication and time commitment. My colleagues are my age, the 9 to 5 works for them, but there'll be days where, 9 to 5, the other direction works better for the students I'm working with, depending where they are in the country. So I think for me, what prepared me more was an experience that forced me kind of to look beyond that and say, how do I find a space and then how do I get the skills I need to ensure that wherever community I'm going into, I have some essential questions that I ask myself and then find people in there to help answer those.
Yeah, I mean, similar to what Derek said, I've always been volunteering. I think I've started volunteering when I was in middle school. So when I got to Dartmouth, I started volunteering again through the Dartmouth Muslim Students Association, which is Al Noor, and as well as through the Graduate Student Council. And I think because I was in a unique position, I'm not a Dartmouth undergrad, but I am a Dartmouth grad student. I got to be part of both the Hanover community and the Dartmouth community. So you get to see how people in Hanover and Lebanon and West Leb lived and, what the needs of the community were and how we can work with the community to ensure that everyone that lived in the Upper Valley had what they needed in order to thrive. And so that was like the service bit, right? Just realizing, even though, in Dartmouth, I was in a completely new community where I didn't know anyone and where I didn't, I was only there for like 3 years. So it's a shorter amount of time, realizing that I did need to continue doing service to feel fulfilled was one of the key things. And then the other thing was, in the MALS program, it's an interdisciplinary program. So you get a chance, you're not studying just one major, quote unquote, you're studying on a track, but you are encouraged to take classes that are not just on globalization, but on cultural studies and general studies. And you're encouraged to take other undergraduate classes at Dartmouth or other grad classes at Dartmouth through the Tuck Business School or anything else. And that, made me realize that I didn't want to work in a field where I was just doing one thing, because I like to keep my mind active, and by doing that is by doing multiple things. My current role is so multifaceted that every time someone asks me what I do for work, it's not one straight answer. It's I do political advocacy and I help people enroll in health insurance, and I help, I run our food distribution program, and I run a mental health initiative, and it's like different things all over the place, and it's all throughout the years that's happened. So that's why, being at Dartmouth and being in this multidisciplinary degree program helped me realize that I just can't do one thing. I have to do multiple things in order for me to feel fulfilled. And that I found was best in doing service work, because a lot of the places that I looked into after Dartmouth to do, to help in my career, it was all just very, one circular role or one thing that you do. But in service, you have that passion and you get to do a lot of different things. So
Yeah, thank you. It was great to hear that, especially as a student and a student at Dartmouth, where things can get so busy, the importance of service and remaining committed to something that you're passionate about, as it can not only help support your community, but help you learn more about yourself. So that was really great to hear. We have a couple questions from our audience. First question, something that I was actually wondering too, so it's great. So what do you think are the major differences between affecting change in the nonprofit sector and working within the public sector to affect change?
I'll just be really quick here. I mean, one of the toughest things for the past 3 months for the nonprofit sector has been that while we are the front line in many cases, we are the back of the line when it comes to influence in the public sector, and especially on Capitol Hill. It has been like, everyone loves you. Everyone thinks that you're doing great work, and for the most part, the nonprofit sector is viewed as a positive, a net positive. But we are also kind of viewed as a sandbox. And that can mean that, you are often, unless you are, with a one or two, unless you're the Red Cross during a hurricane, or unless you're the, or a very specific crisis-driven thing, you are often not taken for granted, but assumed that you will always be there. And I think that's what this crisis has exposed for so many nonprofits is we're not. We stand on the same kind of tectonic plates that everyone else does, and we can rise and fall. So that's been for me the difference, and also just the amount of I wouldn't say it's nonpartisanship, but there's a lot of tiptoeing around things in the nonprofit space because you're trying to appeal to different communities. And I think there's always a tension in the nonprofit world, or are we being too safe in how we advocate versus actually are the people that need us the most need us to become fiercer advocates. And I think that is what I've seen within an organization like the Y that has 100+ years of history is, you are trying to weigh the benefit of where do we drive ourselves on these conversations? Do I have to, I work with students. One of my students was killed in a shooting in California about 2 months ago, and he had just been in DC 2 years earlier advocating for gun safety. But the Y hasn't taken a stance on that. And we're concerned because we have YMCAs all across the country, especially in red communities. So for us, it's always trying to drive that conversation and where you fit into that. And so I think for me, what I'll end on is what I try to do is the direct change that I can do, the change that I can make. Like I can bring together students to talk about gun rights in their community and fix that much quicker sometimes than the public sector can. But at the same time, if you ask me to go onto the Hill and advocate, I am a lot of times stuck between the forces at play that are governing my institutional nonprofit.
Yeah, I mean, alternatively, because I think the Y is so big and it's nationwide, there are a lot more bureaucratic steps. Whereas I work for a smaller nonprofit, it's only located in New York City. And while we're growing right now, previously we were only located in Brooklyn, but now we have offices in all 5 boroughs. So with coming from a smaller nonprofit, there are a lot of benefits, but also, as Derek had mentioned, there are a lot of, barriers that come from having to ensure that a lot of the funders or policymakers that you work with are satisfied with the work that you do. So on the one hand, we have this great program for the youth where we help them empower themselves, right? If there's something that they're really passionate about. So a few years ago, 2016 when Trump was elected, and he was speaking about the Muslim ban. All of our youth came together, spoke at City Hall. They started a no Muslim ban, their own portion of a no Muslim ban campaign in New York City, and they garnered a lot of support for that. It was actually featured in Teen Vogue at one point. And then also for other things such as city is a sanctuary city, so we work a lot with undocumented immigrants, whether they are from the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, or South Asian community, or the Central Asian community, or the Latin American community, or any other community. And we do a lot of work on ensuring that they have healthcare coverage. So you can do small steps like that with working with City Council. We have, advocacy days where different nonprofits are invited to speak their minds and encourage their City Council members to support certain bills. It doesn't always work, right? So as Derek said, one of the things that we try to do is empower the community so that the larger voice we have, the more of an impactful change that we'll have within the community. And another thing that we've been doing since March 15th, in essence, is, a lot of the changes that we needed for our communities, whether it's getting halal and kosher foods that were actual food, because I don't know if anyone who lives in New York City or is familiar with New York City, is that we had, in the beginning stages of the emergency food program, families of color, immigrant families of color, were receiving, especially if they ate kosher or halal food, they were receiving prepackaged food that came from a military distributor that by the time you got it, it was mush. It wasn't real food. It wasn't something that you could eat. And so through advocacy, through like mutual aid networks, which are grassroots efforts, working with community organizers and community-based organizations and nonprofits, we've been able to actually encourage the city to work with like the halal food trucks that are at every corner to provide actual free, fresh food to the community. So it's like doing partnerships with like that, with other grassroots organization that we have been able to affect a little bit more impactful community change, especially during COVID-19. Because, here in March, everything was, people were dying, getting sick. There was, no one could work. And a lot of communities that were highly affected by COVID, such as the Bangladeshi and Yemeni communities in New York, they were afraid to even go get food for themselves. So it was like, it was the mutual aid communities and the nonprofits working with those specific mutual aid networks that was able to help the communities further on a more impactful scale rather than waiting for the city to do something.
So I think maybe talking about the public's affecting change from the public side, there's a couple of different ways you can go. On the political side, kind of being in a congressional office, I mean, that's where you kind of have, some power to affect, to influence legislation. My sense is that if you're working in a congressional office, you got, kind of a big, broad portfolio and you can't go too deep in anything. Kind of a step toward policy is working on a congressional committee where you're focusing on, health, education, labor, and pensions. So it's kind of a little bit more targeted. You can kind of get into the meat of working on drafting policies and revising policies. Kind of another step in the kind of policy direction is working in an agency or department, whereas there you get really in depth with a very kind of specific, granular how policy is actually enacted across the country, but you're constrained by the laws that are passed. So you're not in a position to be changing laws in a big way, but there is some flexibility for interpreting writing regulations within the broad outlines of the laws, but you can't go beyond that. So I guess the work that I do is kind of, we work a lot with federal agencies and departments to do nonpartisan research. So it's basically, we'll be evaluating a program that Congress passed, whether or not we think it's effective. We try to understand how it's being implemented and what the effectiveness of it is. So kind of understanding kind of where you want to sit. There's pros and cons of any of them kind of along that spectrum within the public sector.
Was great. Thank you. I appreciate how comprehensive that was. with all of you together. Another question we have is kind of a mix of a couple questions that we're seeing from the audience. What's the general advice you have about breaking into the nonprofit sector right now, especially post-graduation and kind of navigating that given the financial situation of the average college student after graduating, kind of getting a balance between direct service and high-level work that will allow you to support yourself financially? How have you perhaps navigated that balance, and what do you suggest for the next set of undergrads set to graduate in a few years?
Josh, you go.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump on this and share some thoughts, and then other folks can join in. So I think there's some things that you can do to make yourself like a more appealing applicant in some situations, but I just want to acknowledge a couple of things. So I think one, there is a lot of uncertainty right now, right, about what the landscape is going to look like from a public health perspective, from like a social impact perspective. So I think we're still finding out how the most vulnerable, how Black and Brown communities are being hit by COVID, and we're going to keep learning. There are going to be new policies. So kind of areas of focus and what's at the forefront of people's minds is going to continue to change too as the pandemic adapts. And then I think third, right, on that financial and hiring situation, there's uncertainty. So I just want to acknowledge all those, and I think we can try to give our advice, but you're in a unique landscape right now, but so are all of us, and the Dartmouth alumni community is here to support you and be an advocate for you as you try to navigate all this. So don't hesitate to call on us for that. So I think in terms of the experience that I found as the single most helpful, particularly if you want to be in community-based work or advocacy-based work, is having an experience on your resume or that you can speak to where you've gone out and advocated on behalf of somebody else. So whether that is a mentoring opportunity where you've been able to, go to a school administrator and say, the mentee that I'm working with needs this accommodation or is having this challenge, or, it's within a nonprofit community where you've been part of an issue-based campaign. I think having that experience where you've just been in a setting where it's been a part of your responsibility to speak on behalf of somebody else is really broadly helpful across the nonprofit sector. And I know that when I was making a transition from having really done a lot of political work to trying to do more nonprofit social sector work, the things that I was really asked to speak on are like, how have you been in community? How have you advocated for communities of folks across a lot of lenses of difference? So I think if you're thinking about one experience, that would be my personal advice to think about. In terms of then navigating the market, I guess I would love for other folks to jump in, but I think the two things that I would say from my perspective are, I think unfortunately the kind of the narrower your focus is on the type of job that you want, the longer you might have to be in a search, and that's going to be compounded by the ongoing pandemic. So I get, and I also think that we should acknowledge too that that is going to shape what that opportunity set looks like for a lot of folks, and I think that it's a huge problem. I think there's a lot of advocacy work that needs to be done on making sure that we have debt forgiveness, that we're not making colleges inaccessible financially as it is right now. But I think we have to acknowledge it's going to be a reality. So AmeriCorps programs, right, are a great path into nonprofit space for a lot of folks, but they're not going to be financially doable for other folks. I just want to outline that straight out there. But I think that the broader the set of options that you can say, I'd be comfortable in those and I'm interested in those, then the easier it is going to be able to find an opportunity. And I think if you're holding on to just there's one dream opportunity that I want, it may potentially make it harder to find that right fit. So something that a mentor told me in a job search that I've always kind of kept in mind is like, what can I live with today to build the change that I want to see tomorrow? So what's the role that's going to give me the most of the impact that I want, even if it's not all the way there, and you're going to learn from that and grow from that. So anything that's helpful in there, please feel free to take, and I'll see if anybody else can jump in here with some thoughts too.
I agree with Josh and the fact that if you're looking to be in service work and public, nonprofit work, advocacy is huge. It's key. While in grad school, I was doing AmeriCorps, and that's where I was doing the mental health education programming, but that's not the exact thing that actually got me the job at the Refugee Resettlement Center, which then led to this current job. What ended up helping me was, as I was doing my AmeriCorps program, I was taking care of my grandmother, and I was being a medical advocate for her. My grandmother didn't speak English. She spoke Bengali in a very specific dialect of Bengali where there was no interpretation available for that. So in doing that work, my future, at that time, my future employers, they were really impressed with the fact that I could do medical advocacy without having an actual degree in social work. And that once I got that, I was able to do that same thing for all the refugees that I worked with, ensuring that they had proper care, ensuring that they got the health insurance that they needed, or that they, weren't being treated for schizophrenia when they really had depression, right? It was just all these little nuances that kind of, by doing that singular, advocacy, helped me in my career immensely. And it's not to say that, the AmeriCorps position didn't help me at all. It did help me because it gave me those skills to understand health a lot more so that I could be a better medical advocate for my grandmother, that in turn helped me become a better medical advocate for the refugees that I was working with a few years ago. Another thing that I want to say is that it is really hard navigating, the finances, especially now. There are a lot of have had to shut down due to the financial situation due to COVID. And because we're all in very unique situations, some nonprofits have come out stronger and have not thrived, but they're more resilient to what's happening right now because of the unique natures of their programming. And some, because they are very niche nonprofits, have to put their services on hold for some time. So I would say that, like, when you're looking at, your future career perspectives, look at nonprofits that, if you want to have a little bit more nonprofits that have wider ranges of, like, what do they do in terms of service work? Is it just one thing that they focus on, or do they focus on multiple priorities? And then, yeah, I think that's about it. I do understand it is, like, difficult to live on a nonprofit salary, but the certain nonprofit that I work for ensures that we all have livable New York wages, which is really, really great. Otherwise, I don't think a lot of the people that are in my agency would have been able to survive on typical nonprofit wages and living in New York City with the high cost of living. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think working in service doesn't mean that you have to, be self-sacrificing. It's perfectly okay, I think, when you get an offer, to negotiate, to ask if there's a way, they can pay you more. Yeah, I think it's important to be able to, kind of support yourself while doing the work.
Look, for me, I was unique because I had a kind of a singular approach to this. Like, I knew what I wanted to do. And I actually, every position I've had to create within the organization. So what didn't exist. So a lot of times there's a little bit of advocacy in there for yourself and for understanding what's needed, because nonprofits are always changing. And that's actually something that I think I appreciate the most in some of my colleagues is, how do we need to adapt? How do we need to change? And that's not always accepted in a lot of nonprofits, particularly ones that have kind of a set way of doing things. And while that is, while that can be a challenge, it can also be a space for you to showcase something that they might not have known about. I don't think I need to be any, blunter about the salaries. It's tough. I think the other thing, and this is going to tie into, I think, to the next question, is a lot of my colleagues who are colleagues of color, female colleagues, LGBT colleagues, are also different. They are now helping. They are asking me, the tall white dude in the organization, to confront what's been going on in groups like the Y for a long time. And our salaries aren't always public, but more of us are talking about that. A lot of younger nonprofits employees are having those conversations. The nonprofit gap between the C-suite and people in the front lines is gigantic. And it's also a gap between a what we call pale and stale and male up at the top, and then a completely different generation at the bottom. So the nonprofit world is reckoning with that. And quite frankly, if you can come in and be a voice that's advocating for it, I can't guarantee that it won't, that you'll get what you want, because nonprofits have a limitation on resources. But what I will say is that advocacy will drive you towards the right nonprofit. If they're not willing to give you the support system to make sure that that's possible, then there probably isn't the right fit for you. And at the same time, I think as the sector is evolving, they are trying to find ways to address that. So I think there's never ever allow yourself, as Brian just mentioned, everyone else has mentioned, to be sold short, to be told, well, you're not worth that. And the last thing I will say is, remember where you came from. And the reason I say that is a lot of nonprofits probably helped you get where you are in life. A lot of nonprofits are part of making you who you are. Start with them. Start back home. I think there's kind of this I got to go help someone in inner city wherever, or in rural Kentucky, or in Nome, Alaska. No, your chances are there's a lot of really good nonprofit work being done back home where you have a lot of connections. And I think someone would mention, how do we deal with not having connections during an era of COVID? Start back home. You've got a lot of really good connections there, and chances are the United Way, the community foundation, whatever it is has a place where you can start. You can say, I'm a student from so-and-so high school, and that can start the conversation. So start local and start with a locality you know.
Great, thank you. It's very clear that those characteristics you mentioned before, those of flexibility, of patience, are really key to not just supporting others in the nonprofit field, but getting yourself into the nonprofit field and exploring that for yourself. A couple questions left from the audience. First question, and Derek, you kind of alluded to this. I don't know if you want to speak more on it, or if anyone else would like to speak on it. Is how has your work changed to fight for racial equity and justice in response to the nationwide call for Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, so I'll just touch on this really quickly because it kind of hit us like a tidal wave, particularly with the young students we work with. The why, as I mentioned, we've become a very safe organization. The joke in the office is we're not R or D, we're the Y, right? We want to make sure everyone likes us. And the problem with that, of course, is that not all issues fall in that space. And for a long time, it has felt like too many of my colleagues who are working with these communities are saying the why is not only our safe approach is undermining our approach to serve communities. So in many ways, the voices of what has happened has actually helped grow that chorus within our organization. It has completely, I think it's jarring to a lot of them too, to see all this happen all at once. It's kind of like, wait, now you'll do it. So I think there's a little bit of there's almost kind of now of a don't burn out, don't make this just a 2-month thing. This has to become institutional in the same way the institutional racism was built in the organization for hundreds of years. Many Ys didn't desegregate until the 70s or 80s in the South, and in the Midwest. So I think there's a reckoning coming. I mean, a lot of nonprofits are having to, just look on Instagram. There's an account called Black at the Y. And it is a lot of stories, and a lot of other nonprofits are getting these. There are stories that within that space, because of our mission, because of the good work we were doing, often went not ignored, but brushed away. Says, well, they're doing good work, so there's not really an issue there. When there's some serious institutional problems. That said, I do think one of the challenges, and this is something that I'm challenging a lot of my colleagues on, is, there are very few large institutional nonprofits that don't have those issues, but also there are very few small ones that have the scale that those do. So how do we, that's kind of always for right now, that's the question, is how do we help, because we have that scale, how do we scale up the change that we need to make very quickly within our organization, knowing that there's a lot of top-down pressure that doesn't necessarily get the same reaction to this that we're seeing from our young people.
Yeah, on our end, my nonprofit our headquarters is located in the heart of downtown Brooklyn, where there's a large Yemeni community, there's a large Sudanese and Somali community, there's a large Black American community, and there's so many different ethnic groups. And while our organization is called the Arab American Family Support Center, our doors are open to all. And that's always been the case since our founding in 1994. However, because our organization is primarily run by Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, or South Asian folks, there is a lot of anti-Blackness in our communities. So lately, and this has been, I want to say prior to COVID, talks about microaggressions in the workplace, especially concerning race, talks about anti-Blackness in the workplace. That's what started, that we were starting to do that because a lot of the, not just the clients that we work with, but a lot of our staff were feeling, you know, even though they were working in a organization of color, a lot of our Black staff weren't feeling that they were being accepted and that there wasn't a lot of respect there because of the anti-Blackness that is deeply instilled into South Asian and Middle Eastern, you know, societies. So we've been working on that. We've been having workshops on how to combat microaggressions. We've been having talks with different community members on how to be more inclusive and how to be more, you know, incorporate everyone's voices. And we've also started changing up the organization in the sense that now we have several colleagues who are Black and who are in supervisory roles, which we didn't have prior to this year. So we're making those small incremental changes to show that we are inclusive, not just in name, but in practice. And we're hoping to continue doing this because our work does not just affect immigrant communities or just Muslim communities, because we have to recognize that Muslim communities can be any color. There are Black Muslims. Black Muslims were in the US before any other immigrant Muslims came to the US after the 60s, right? So with that in mind, we're trying to combat the anti-Blackness within our own communities and working with our youth in encouraging them to, one thing that happens in New York a lot is like our Black and brown youth like to, not Black and brown, but the brown youth like to use the N-word a lot, helping them realize that that's not okay, right? Just because you grew up in communities, you grew up in Flatbush, you grew up in Brownsville, or you grew up in the Bronx, that does not mean that you can use the N-word just because your Black friend said it was okay. You cannot say it because you did not have the same experiences, right? So doing these small lessons with our youth is one of the biggest things that we can encourage. And also we have been working a lot with other organizations that work with a lot of Black and brown youth that are non-Arab, non-South Asians. And that has been helpful for us to like be more inclusive and be better in combating anti-Blackness in our own communities and also promoting Black Lives Matter. So those are some of the things that we've been doing.
All right.
Brenda, I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to step in on that, but I just wanted to say really quickly from my perspective. So I think something that from having done work that with Lawyers Committee that like explicitly had a racial focus. So we were talking about racial injustice, particularly anti-Black discrimination and systems of discrimination kind of every day. And then now being at an organization where racial justice is part of what we do, but it wasn't as central into our work. Just a couple of insights where I feel like there are things that Lawyers Committee did better around this that I'm pushing for now. So I think the first is, as an organization responds, is it doing it as an add-in to existing programming or as an add-on? So as our response, let's look at the fundamental tenets of what we do every day and the way that those programs perpetuate racial discrimination and discrimination against the Black community? Or are we saying, okay, here's a fun program that we can create out of scratch, we can do for new, but we'll keep doing everything the way that we've been doing it. So I think there's got to be looking at that add-in, like how are you building into what you do every day a lens of thinking about racial discrimination and racial injustice. And then I think the second is who at the organization is being looked on to lead that work. So I think there are too many organizations that, as Derek talked about earlier, are really white in senior leadership, and they're building in racial diversity in kind of junior staff, and then they're putting additional work on those folks to drive the work. So I think you want to push your organization to really have a broad range of commitment. So make sure there's buy-in from across the organization and also really pushing senior folks to be responsive. So just wanted to add those two things, something that I'm pushing for internally in my role now, and I encourage folks to push for in the organizations that they're a part of.
Yeah. And just real quickly, in the field of evaluation, it's a lot of overlap with the field of social sciences. So it's overwhelmingly white. So there are kind of blind spots baked into that. So, part of what we do is looking inward, which is making an effort to understand, our pipeline, the people that we're hiring, kind of even the people who submit applications, kind of backing up for the people who submit applications to build a pipeline of welcoming people of color into the field. And then also examining the practice of evaluation, which you might think is empirical and data driven and kind of like agnostic, but it does have, there's been a conversation in the field recently about ways in which the practice of program evaluation overlooks contributions of communities of color or does not reflect the interests of those communities. So that's something that the whole field is grappling with, including apt associates.
Great, thank you for that. We have one more question just before we end today. And this is kind of based on past two questions, but what can we do now within the restrictions from COVID to learn more about nonprofit work since direct service and shadowing isn't possible?
Right, I can say for APT, we moved our whole summer internship program online. So, it's still a little bit tricky and, not quite the same experience, but we're still really trying to get people involved, get some experience in the organization. So I'd say my sense is other organizations are. So if there's an internship program or some sort of job shadowing program, people are more than happy to figure out a way to do that online.
Yeah, a lot of us are going online. You're going to have to, so learn it. If it's not comfortable, get comfortable with it. Because a lot of nonprofit folks are having to adapt to this. So if you don't be afraid of it, don't be, yes, there's some burnout to it, but find those chances and take them. And again, what I said earlier is look homeward. Like if you're going to be home, if you're going to be off campus, if you're going to be like, look around your own community. Think about, talk to your family about who helped when I was a kid. Like it might have been the Y, it might have been a different nonprofit. It might have been a group that you didn't really know about that is in need of something that might have a space for you to do that. So again, I would look local and home. And when you do that, you also might find some that are more in person or more tactile than just the screens we're all talking to.
Yeah. I would echo the internship part. Our organization, I'm actually overseeing a group of 4 interns who are doing research on the impact of COVID-19 on the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian communities. We meet every day for about an hour and we discuss what they're researching and if they need any help from me in terms of how to synthesize research. And I help them, and schedule interviews with stakeholders. So that's one way like our organization has been able to, incorporate internships and kind of encourage youth to, look into the nonprofit world. Another thing that I would suggest is, as Derek said, look back home. A lot of you are home right now. And, there are a lot of people who need help. They need access to food, whether they're elderly or immunocompromised. They, for one reason or another, just can't go to the grocery store to get food or pick up their medication. And depending on where you are, you may be in peak levels of COVID. And so I would suggest, if you don't already have one in your town or your neighborhood, starting a mutual aid network. It's not just unique to New York City. I've seen mutual aid networks pop up in my hometown where there's an entire, senior living facility that no one could really, besides the people who did the immediate work there. A lot of the seniors that live there, they're independent seniors, but they couldn't go to the store to get their groceries. So a mutual aid network was formed, help them get their groceries. Or, a lot of people who are have cancer and cannot leave their houses due to, chemotherapy and radiation. A mutual aid network was able to get them their medication that they needed from the pharmacy, as well as other, groceries and necessity toiletries that they needed. This is one of the best times that you can do service work for your community because of the need our communities have. I've seen so many youth in the mutual aid networks, both in Connecticut and New York, just rise up to leadership positions in these small grassroots organizations. And, they're doing it for the love of their community. We actually have been able to hire a few of those youth who have then graduated from college back in May to work for our organization. So it's like, because of that experience and that unique, you know, this is what's happening during COVID and this is how I'm adapting to COVID and helping out my community, you know, that is something that nonprofits will definitely value.
Yeah, I think I would just close from my end by echoing what Farah just said. So there may be some organizations that have canceled internship programs, and I think it's easy to get caught up on kind of that formal program that I was looking for is not there, but there is so much work to be done in your local community, whether it's mutual aid networks, whether it's other community-based organizations. There's work to be done for your loved ones and your peers to help support them. And I think to the extent that you can engage in that work, you're going to learn a ton from it. You're going to be there for the people that you care about and that you're in community with. So I think don't undersell the value of what, like, even if it's not going to be a clear line item in my resume, where's the need right now in my family, in my friends, in my community, and are there ways that can be helpful? I think the lessons that you'll learn by showing up for your community in that way will be really helpful, even if you're not, you know, ending up with that really neat line item on the resume. You're going to be there for folks that you love, and you're going to learn a lot from that experience.
Wow, that was fantastic. That was inspiring. It's so nice to hear practical advice balanced with real-time COVID ramifications, and also why we are all working in nonprofits. So that was really great. I want to thank each of our panelists. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for giving up your time. I want to thank Shadi. You did a great job writing herd on all these panelists. It was great. Just a reminder, we have one panel left next Monday at 5, dealing with international development. The other thing that the panelists graciously did was they agreed to share their contact info. So we will close by putting their contact info up on a slide. Feel free to take a screenshot. If you forget, you can always email the Rockefeller Center and we'll be happy to send their contact info to you. So on behalf of the Rockefeller Center, thanks to all.